My name is Naomi, 32 years old, and I am a fractional chief financial officer managing portfolios for some of the most affluent estates in Atlanta. For the past decade, I have also been the invisible bank, funding my family's illusion of wealth. The notification illuminated my phone screen in the quiet darkness of my penthouse living room. The group chat was ironically named Family First. The message was from my mother, Vivian, a woman whose entire existence revolved around her position as the event director for our city's largest megachurch. Her text read exactly like this: "We have all agreed you are no longer part of this family. You embarrass us. Do not show up to any family gatherings. Get out of my life." I sat perfectly still watching the screen. My brother Jamal liked the message, and my sister Kiara sent a thumbs up emoji. There was no hesitation, no follow-up message saying it was a joke, just a cold, calculated dismissal from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Growing up, I was always the outsider. I was the dark-skinned girl who preferred spreadsheets over the rigid respectability politics of Atlanta's black elite. Vivian spent my childhood criticizing my quiet demeanor. Kiara was the legacy sorority queen with the flawless silk press and the perfect politician husband, someone who thrived on the superficial validation of her peers. Jamal was the golden child, a self-proclaimed entrepreneur who spent his days pretending to be a cryptocurrency investor while producing absolutely nothing of value, yet he could do no wrong in my mother's eyes. I was the rebel who asked too many questions and refused to pretend that our family was perfect. They saw me as dry, boring, and socially inept. They told friends I was a struggling freelancer hiding my success. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. You are going to want to hear exactly how this night ended. When I read that message, I did not cry. I did not call them begging for an explanation or an apology. I had spent 32 years swallowing my pride to keep the peace. I had endured the snide remarks about my appearance, the constant comparisons to Kiara, and the blatant favoritism shown to Jamal. I had paid for my place in this family with my wallet because they made it clear that my personality was not enough. I was tired of being the reliable workhorse they could mock in public and milk in private. But staring at that text, something inside me finally snapped clean in half. The invisible chain of obligation dissolved. My apartment was a sanctuary of modern art and quiet sophistication, a stark contrast to the loud, chaotic energy of my childhood home. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of their rejection settle into my bones. I picked up my phone and typed a simple four-word reply: "Thanks for confirming." Then I removed myself from the group chat. That was the end of the emotional reaction. What followed was a masterclass in financial detachment. I walked over to my home office and opened my encrypted laptop. The screen cast a cool blue glow over my mahogany desk. For 5 years, I had quietly subsidized my family's opulent lifestyle. When they faced bankruptcy behind closed doors, I stepped in. I never asked for gratitude, and they certainly never offered it. They simply expected it as my tithe to the family name. Every single dollar was a testament to my hard work, my late nights analyzing spreadsheets, and my relentless drive to build an independent wealth management firm. They had mocked my ambition while secretly spending the fruits of my labor. I logged into my master banking portal. The interface loaded, displaying the numerous accounts I managed. I navigated to the automated transfers section. First on the list was the mortgage. My parents lived in a sprawling brick mansion in a highly exclusive suburban neighborhood. It was the ultimate symbol of their social standing, the place where they hosted lavish church events and pretended to be generational wealth. I had saved it from foreclosure years ago. The monthly mortgage payment was $7,000. I clicked the red cancel button. A prompt asked if I was sure I wanted to terminate this recurring payment. I clicked confirm, without a single ounce of regret. Next, I moved to the vehicle leases. Vivian drove a pristine Mercedes SUV. Jamal drove a sleek sports car. The combined monthly lease payment was $1,500. I canceled the payment authorization, but I did not stop there. I opened the dealership application on my phone and remotely deactivated their engine starters. They were now nothing more than very expensive lawn ornaments. Finally, I addressed the telecommunications account. The family was on a premium corporate phone plan that I paid for. It included unlimited international roaming, the highest tier of data access, and annual device upgrades for Vivian, Kiara, and Jamal. The monthly bill was $970. I selected all their lines and suspended the service. Total expenses wiped out equaled $9,470 a month. For years, I had justified this financial drain as the cost of belonging. I had convinced myself that providing for them was my duty. But as I closed the laptop, I realized I had not been buying their love. I had been funding my own abuse. The financial umbilical cord was officially severed. They wanted me out of their lives, and I was simply honoring their request to the fullest extent possible. There would be no more bailouts, no more hidden transfers, and absolutely no more compromises. The silence in my penthouse felt different now. It was no longer heavy with anxiety or the dread of the next demanding phone call. It was a profound, liberating peace. I stood up from my desk, feeling a physical lightness in my shoulders. I had reclaimed my power, my resources, and my dignity all at once. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon. I took a slow sip, savoring the complex flavors, and waited. I knew their routines perfectly. I knew exactly how and when the reality of their situation would hit them. I carried my glass to the living room and sat on the plush velvet sofa. My phone was set to Do Not Disturb. The digital clock on the screen shifted to 2 in the morning. The screen lit up. It was a call from Jamal. I watched it ring silently until it went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, another call, then another. The notifications began stacking up rapidly. 10 missed calls, 20 missed calls, 40 missed calls. In my mind's eye, I could see exactly what was happening across the city. Jamal was likely at an upscale VIP nightclub downtown, surrounded by his entourage and women he was trying to impress. He would have signaled the waiter for another round of expensive champagne, casually tossing his premium credit card onto the silver tray. I could imagine the exact moment the waiter returned, leaning in respectfully to whisper that the card had been declined. Jamal would have laughed it off, trying another card only to find that one frozen as well. The embarrassment would be instantaneous and humiliatingly public. The security guards, noticing the unpaid tab and the sudden lack of funds, would politely but firmly escort him and his entourage out the back door, shattering his wealthy facade in front of his peers. He would be left standing on the curb, completely powerless. Meanwhile, Vivian was probably experiencing her own nightmare. I envisioned her walking out to the driveway, dressed immaculately, pressing the ignition button on her Mercedes. Nothing would happen. She would try again, frustration mounting, before pulling out her phone to call Jamal or my father for help, only to discover her phone service had been completely deactivated. She would stare at the no service indicator on her screen in pure disbelief. No internet, no cellular connection, absolutely no way to communicate. The sheer panic of suddenly being cut off from their money, their luxury items, and their precious social lifelines would be setting in fast. The daughter they had so casually discarded was the foundation their entire elite existence rested upon. Without me, their house of cards was collapsing in real time. They had demanded I get out of their lives, yet here they were desperately trying to pull me back in the second their comfort was threatened. Their entitlement had finally collided with my boundaries. I took another sip of wine, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction. But how did a family so obsessed with maintaining their public image push their only real provider to this breaking point? To understand the absolute chaos unfolding tonight, we have to go back exactly 48 hours to an anniversary dinner that changed everything. 48 hours before my phone blew up with desperate notifications, I walked through the brass double doors of the Sovereign. It is the most exclusive steakhouse in Atlanta, the kind of establishment where reservations take months, and the maitre d' knows your net worth before you even hand over your coat. The occasion was Kiara and DeAndre's 5th wedding anniversary. DeAndre is the charismatic lead pastor of a sprawling megachurch, and my sister Kiara plays the role of the devoted, flawless First Lady with terrifying precision. I arrived exactly on time, dressed in a sharp, tailored, charcoal pantsuit, feeling confident, after a grueling but successful board meeting. The hostess led me to a private dining room draped in heavy velvet and gold accents. As expected, the family had already claimed the premium seats. DeAndre sat at the head of the long oak table holding court. Kiara sat to his right, wearing a blindingly sparkly cocktail dress that looked more suited for a beauty pageant stage than a family dinner. My mother Vivian sat opposite them, her posture rigid, dripping in pearls. Jamal was slouched next to her, tapping away on his latest smartphone. I was directed to the very end of the table near the swinging kitchen doors. The physical distance perfectly mirrored the emotional chasm between us. I had barely taken my seat and placed my napkin on my lap when Vivian initiated her customary assault. She did not bother with a greeting. Instead, she peered at me over her crystal water goblet and sighed heavily. "Zuri," she began, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive concern. "We are at a 5-star establishment. Could you not have made an effort?" I glanced down at my custom suit, which cost more than her entire outfit, and met her gaze. "I came straight from the office, Mom." Vivian clicked her tongue, a sound designed to convey maximum disapproval. "That suit is so severely masculine. And look at your natural hair." She gestured vaguely at my carefully maintained natural curls. "It looks unfinished. You really should let Kiara's stylist give you a proper silk press. You look like you are going to a union meeting, not a high society celebration. Look at your sister." Kiara practically preened, adjusting her posture to highlight her expensive glittering neckline. "Kiara knows how to present herself as a woman of substance," Vivian continued smoothly. "A woman who commands respect and attracts the right kind of attention. It is no wonder you are still single, Zuri. You intimidate men with this harsh corporate energy. You need to soften up if you ever want a ring on your finger." I felt the familiar sting of her words, the subtle colorism and blatant disrespect she weaponized so effortlessly. I was the dark-skinned daughter, with natural hair constantly positioned as the rugged, less desirable contrast to Kiara's lighter, carefully curated standard of beauty. I simply took a slow sip of my ice-cold, sparkling water and completely ignored the predictable bait. I absolutely refused to ever let her completely ruin my peaceful evening. The waiter arrived carrying a leather-bound menu that felt heavier than a textbook. DeAndre did not even bother opening his. He ordered the Japanese A5 Wagyu tomahawk, a towering seafood tower featuring Maine lobsters and 3 bottles of a vintage Dom Perignon that cost more than most people make in a month. Vivian and Kiara followed suit, requesting caviar-topped appetizers, truffle-infused mashed potatoes, and the most extravagant cuts of meat available. Jamal ordered a bone-in ribeye and excitedly asked the sommelier to bring a bottle of their rarest scotch. They behaved like royalty, demanding absolute perfection from the waitstaff and speaking loudly enough to ensure the adjacent tables knew exactly how much money they were supposedly spending. I quietly ordered a simple filet mignon and a side of roasted asparagus, silently watching their grandiose, arrogant performance with a highly detached clinical eye. Once the extravagant feast arrived, the conversation shifted to their favorite topic themselves. DeAndre leaned back, slicing into his wagyu, and loudly proclaimed that his church was launching a massive multi-million-dollar building expansion next quarter. "We are buying the entire commercial block next to the sanctuary," he boasted, raising his champagne glass. "The Lord is truly blessing our congregation, and the new media center will solidify our legacy in this city forever." Vivian beamed with immense pride, lifting her own glass to tap against his. "And what about you, Jamal?" she asked, turning her adoring gaze to my brother. "Tell us about your latest business ventures." Jamal puffed out his chest, adjusting the collar of his flashy designer shirt. "Oh, you know how it is. The crypto market is incredibly volatile, but my proprietary trading algorithm is practically printing money right now. I just closed a massive deal with some private offshore investors. We are talking generational wealth, Mom. We are building an empire. Kiara clapped her hands together in exaggerated delight, praising her brother's alleged financial genius. They carried on like this for the next 40 minutes, painting a magnificent portrait of boundless prosperity, divine favor, and unstoppable entrepreneurial success. But I sat there silently chewing my steak, listening to the hollow ring of their endless boasting. As a fractional chief financial officer who managed actual wealth for legitimate billionaires, I possessed a highly trained internal lie detector. I knew the unforgiving reality of numbers, and the math presented at this table did not add up. DeAndre's mega church attendance had actually been steadily declining for the past 2 full years, significantly dropping their tithe revenue. Jamal had zero background in software development or quantitative finance, making his claims about proprietary trading algorithms utterly laughable. The luxury cars they proudly drove, the designer clothes they wore, and the massive estate they lived in were entirely subsidized by my silent, ongoing financial interventions. They were putting on a brilliant theatrical production of a wealthy black dynasty, desperately trying to convince themselves and the restaurant staff that they were untouchable. I always knew the undeniable truth. They were actually completely and utterly broke. When the dessert plates were cleared away, the festive atmosphere abruptly vanished, replaced by a suffocating, heavy tension. DeAndre wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, cleared his throat loudly, and gave my mother a pointed look. Vivian reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it straight down the table until it stopped right in front of my water glass. I stared at the blank cover, feeling a familiar wave of dread wash over me. "What exactly is this?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat and totally devoid of any visible emotion. "It is a standard loan guarantor application," Vivian stated briskly, carefully avoiding my direct gaze. Jamal ran into a tiny little snag with his offshore investors. "It is nothing major, just a temporary cash flow issue. He needs $250,000 to bridge the gap until his algorithm stabilizes." I slowly opened the heavy folder. The glaring financial numbers practically screamed off the thick white pages. It was not a tiny little snag. Jamal had not just lost money in a volatile market. He had taken $250,000 of investor money, which I quickly realized from the attached wire transfers was actually diverted directly from DeAndre's church building fund, and lost every single penny of it in an obvious cryptocurrency scam. My brilliant entrepreneurial brother had been completely conned, and DeAndre was facing a massive financial deficit right before his heavily publicized expansion project. They desperately needed exactly $250,000 immediately. "You want me to co-sign a loan for $250,000? I asked, looking up at them in absolute disbelief. DeAndre leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the oak table. "Not just co-sign, Zuri. We need you to use your firm's assets as collateral. Your business credit is flawless. The bank will approve the transfer by tomorrow morning, and nobody in the congregation ever has to know about this minor setback. We are family. We protect our own." I looked at Kiara, who was suddenly staring very hard at her diamond ring, completely silent. I looked at Jamal, who had the audacity to roll his eyes as if I were simply being uncooperative. "I am certainly not risking my business and my personal livelihood to cover up blatant embezzlement," I said firmly, closing the folder and pushing it away. Vivian slammed her hands flat on the table, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated malice. "You selfish, ungrateful girl. We gave you absolutely everything in life, and this is how you choose to repay us today. You will pick up a pen and sign those legal documents right now. If you refuse to support your own flesh and blood, I will personally make sure every major client in this city drops your precious firm." I currently sit on the executive board of 3 different influential commerce leagues. "I will tell them you are unstable, untrustworthy, and completely toxic. I promise that I will systematically and ruthlessly destroy absolutely everything you have built. I looked at the perfectly manicured finger my mother had forcefully tapped against the signature line of the fraudulent contract. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my hand flat against the heavy manila folder and pushed it very slowly across the polished oak table until it gently bumped against DeAndre's water glass. I am not signing anything. I stated, my voice cutting through the thick, tense air of the private dining room. I turned my attention to my younger brother, who was suddenly avoiding my gaze. Jamal, you absolutely do not have a proprietary trading algorithm. You certainly do not have offshore private investors. What you have is a textbook Ponzi scheme that will destroy everything. You took exactly $250,000 of church funds, likely promising DeAndre an impossible return on investment to fund his ridiculous expansion project, and you funneled it into a dead cryptocurrency wallet. You were conned by a basic internet scam because you refused to actually learn how finance works. The heavy silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Kiara audibly gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her chest. Jamal turned a deep, embarrassed shade of crimson, opening his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He knew I had completely dismantled his entire facade in under 30 seconds. DeAndre, however, did not retreat. His pastoral charm vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, volatile fury. He slammed his heavy fist onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses and causing the silverware to jump. "How dare you speak to your brother that way?" DeAndre roared, his voice booming with the theatrical outrage he usually reserved for his Sunday sermons. He leaned aggressively across the table, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "This is exactly why you are sitting here alone. You are a bitter single woman who has absolutely no concept of what family loyalty actually means. You sit in your glass tower, judging us, looking down on the people who raised you. We came to you for a simple favor, a minor financial bridge to keep this family moving forward, and you treat us like criminals." I kept my posture perfectly straight, refusing to shrink back from his physical intimidation. "Taking church donations to fund a fake crypto investment is not a minor setback, DeAndre," I replied smoothly. "It is wire fraud. It is embezzlement. And if the federal government decides to audit your so-called building fund, you will be trading your custom-tailored suits for a federal prison uniform. My absolute refusal to commit corporate suicide for your vanity project does not make me bitter. It makes me the only sane person at this table who actually understands the law." DeAndre's face contorted with rage, but before he could launch into another aggressive tirade, my mother, Vivian, stood up abruptly from her chair, scraping the heavy wood loudly against the pristine floor, preparing to deliver her ultimate verdict. Vivian glared down at me with an expression of pure disgust. The carefully constructed mask of the elegant megachurch, First Lady, completely dissolved, revealing the profound cruelty she had harbored toward me my entire life. "You have always been the dark, difficult child in this family," she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "Even when you were little, you were stubborn and ungrateful. You lack the grace and warmth that your sister possesses. You lack the entrepreneurial spirit of your brother. We have tried to love you, Zuri. We have tried to include you in our blessed circle, but you insist on being a difficult, unyielding burden." Her words were designed to break me, a calculated deployment of the colorism and emotional abuse I had endured for decades. But tonight they simply bounced off my armor. I watched her practically shaking with self-righteous indignation. "You think your little money management job makes you superior to us?" Vivian continued, pointing a manicured nail at my chest. "You are nothing without the foundation this family provided. You are an embarrassment to our name. I will not sit here and allow you to disrespect my son and my son-in-law when they are doing the Lord's work. If you refuse to be a team player and help your family when we explicitly ask for your assistance, then you do not deserve to be in our presence. Get out of our sight." I did not move a single muscle. I remained seated in my chair, holding my mother's furious gaze without blinking. "Actually," I replied calmly, "I think you are the ones who need to leave." Vivian scoffed dramatically, grabbing her expensive designer handbag from the back of her chair. Fine. We will not spend another second breathing the same air as someone so utterly devoid of family loyalty. DeAndre, Kiara, Jamal. We are leaving. The family immediately scrambled to comply with her dramatic exit. Kiara grabbed her sequined clutch, casting a look of profound pity in my direction, as if I were a lost cause. Jamal stood up, refusing to even look at me. His shoulders slumped in defeat. DeAndre adjusted his suit jacket, shooting me one final glare of absolute contempt. They marched out of the private dining room in a grand huff of performative self-righteousness, leaving a trail of heavy cologne and expensive perfume in their wake. They slammed the brass door shut behind them. The sudden quiet in the room was deafening. 30 seconds later, the private dining room door slowly swung open. The head waiter stepped inside, cautiously carrying a small silver tray. He looked around the empty room, clearly confused by the sudden disappearance of my loud, demanding family. He slowly approached the end of the table, where I sat all alone, and gently placed the silver tray next to my water glass. It was the heavily itemized dinner bill, totaling exactly $3,500. I stared down at it in silence. I picked up the small black leather booklet and looked directly at the absolutely astronomical total. It was exactly $3,500. For vintage champagne they drank to celebrate a fraudulent empire. For Wagyu steaks they ordered just to prove they could. I reached into my purse, pulled out my solid metal black card, and placed it on the silver tray without batting an eye. As the waiter walked away to process the payment, the absolute absurdity of my life crashed down on me. My family did not view me as a daughter or a sister. They viewed me as a highly functional, entirely disposable automated teller machine. They expected me to fund their delusions of grandeur. And the moment I refused to be complicit in their financial crimes, they discarded me and left me with the check. I signed the receipt, added a generous 20% tip for the poor waiter, who had to endure their insufferable arrogance, and walked out of the steakhouse with my head held high. That was 2 nights ago. We snapped back to the present morning just hours after my mother officially kicked me out of the family group chat. The bright morning sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse corner office. The Atlanta skyline stretched out beneath me, a glittering testament to real money and actual power. I stood by the glass, slowly sipping a freshly brewed espresso, feeling completely untethered and profoundly free. The financial guillotine I had executed at 2 a.m. had firmly established my ultimate boundaries. They were cut off permanently. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop, ready to conquer the day and dive into a legitimate quarterly earnings report for one of my billionaire clients. My mind was sharp, entirely unbothered by the fact that my family was likely waking up to the catastrophic realization that their endless supply of money had suddenly evaporated. The quiet silence in my office was pristine, representing the new peace I had finally chosen for myself. Then the sleek intercom on my desk lit up, shattering the tranquility. A sharp buzz echoed through the large room. I pressed the silver button. "Yes, Chloe," I said calmly. My receptionist's voice trembled slightly through the speaker. "Miss Zuri, I am so extremely sorry to interrupt your morning, but your mother, your brother, and your brother-in-law are down in the main lobby. They completely bypassed the ground floor security checkpoint, and they are currently screaming at the concierge desk. They are demanding to see you immediately, and they are causing a massive scene." I felt a cold, familiar spike of adrenaline. They had actually dared to bring their toxic circus directly to my corporate sanctuary. Chloe's voice dropped to a panicked whisper. "Miss Zuri, the security guards could not stop them in time. They are already inside the private elevator, and they are coming right up to your office floor now." The heavy oak double doors of my office suite flew open before I could instruct Chloe to call security. My mother Vivian led the charge, storming across the pristine marble floors of my reception area. She was followed closely by DeAndre and Jamal. They looked completely unhinged. The perfectly curated facade they displayed 48 hours ago at the steakhouse was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, frantic desperation. I remained seated behind my desk, my hands resting lightly on my keyboard. I simply watched them march into my sanctuary like rabid animals. Jamal reached my desk first, violently slamming his palms against the polished wood. His designer shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he screamed. "I was at Rain 5 IP Club last night with 6 incredibly important investors." I handed the waitress my premium credit card to cover a $5,000 minimum, and it declined immediately. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? Security literally dragged me out the back alley like a common criminal. I had to beg a promoter for a pathetic ride home. "You completely ruined my reputation in a single night." Before I could address his tantrum, Vivian aggressively pushed him aside. Her perfectly sprayed hair was slightly frizzy and she was breathing heavily. "Forget the stupid nightclub," she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger directly at my face. I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock this morning to the horrific sound of a commercial tow truck backing aggressively into my driveway. I walked outside in my bathrobe just in time to see them hooking up my Mercedes SUV. When I angrily demanded to know what they were doing, the driver handed me a formal repossession notice. "A repossession notice, Zuri." My wealthy neighbors were outside walking their expensive dogs. They stood there and watched the entire humiliating spectacle unfold. "How dare you terminate my vehicle lease without any prior warning? You vindictive, spiteful, terrible girl!" DeAndre stood directly behind them, his face dark and furious like a looming thundercloud. "This is an absolute outrage," he declared loudly, puffing out his chest to project his booming pastoral authority into the quiet room. "You absolutely do not treat your own family this way. You do not just turn off the financial faucet because you threw a temper tantrum at a family dinner. We had an explicit financial agreement." I slowly leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, casually interlacing my fingers. I let the absolute silence in the room stretch out completely, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable echo of their own unhinged shouting. Chloe and 3 junior analysts were staring through the glass walls, completely paralyzed by the unfolding spectacle. "We never had any agreement," I finally said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion whatsoever. "I simply paid your exorbitant bills because you were incapable of managing your own chaotic lives. So I officially cut all the massive dead family weight." DeAndre recognized that my absolute lack of an emotional response meant his aggressive intimidation tactics were fundamentally failing. Like any seasoned manipulator, he immediately switched his strategy to exploit his position of spiritual power. He took a heavy step forward, placing his hands firmly on his hips, and lowered his voice into the deep, resonant cadence he always utilized during his Sunday morning sermons. "You absolutely do not treat your own family this way," he began, pointing at me. "Zuri, the Bible clearly commands us to honor our mother and father," DeAndre proclaimed, his tone dripping with self-righteous authority. "Proverbs tells us that a foolish daughter brings immense grief to her mother. You are acting out of a place of deep, unhealed bitterness. Your absolute refusal to support your own flesh and blood during a minor season of trial is a direct violation of God's law. You need to repent for this terrible hostility. You need to instantly humble yourself, restore those financial accounts immediately, and beg your mother for her forgiveness before your soul is completely corrupted by your own blinding pride." I stared at him, absolutely repulsed by his willingness to weaponize scripture to extort money. Sensing that DeAndre's pastoral guilt trip was not penetrating my armor, Vivian seamlessly transitioned into her secondary persona. The furious, screaming woman vanished in a split second, entirely replaced by a fragile, heartbroken martyr. She dramatically clutched her expensive pearl necklace, her eyes welling up with perfectly timed cinematic tears. She deliberately turned her body slightly, so that Chloe and my junior analysts, who were still watching closely through the glass walls, could clearly see her profound emotional distress. "I do not know what happened to you," Vivian sobbed loudly, pulling a delicate lace handkerchief from her bag to dab at her eyes. "You used to be such a sweet girl, but this cutthroat corporate world has turned your heart into cold, unfeeling stone." She looked out toward my staff, purposely raising her voice so they could hear every single twisted, manipulative word clearly. "She is suffering from a complete mental breakdown," Vivian announced loudly to the entire office. "My poor daughter is deeply unwell right now. The intense stress of her job has completely severed her grip on reality. She is maliciously attacking the people who love her most because she is suffering from a severe psychological crisis." Jamal eagerly jumped onto the aggressive gaslighting bandwagon. "It is incredibly true," he added, shaking his head with mock sadness. "You need serious psychiatric help, Zuri. Normal people do not just wake up and maliciously sabotage their own mother's transportation. You are completely toxic." They stood there, a unified trinity of elite manipulation, fully expecting me to crack under the immense pressure. They wanted me to yell, to cry, to frantically defend my sanity in front of my own employees. They desperately needed me to react emotionally so they could validate their entirely fabricated narrative forever. I did not say a word. Instead of yelling back, I remained perfectly still. I calmly opened the top right drawer of my executive desk. I completely bypassed the sleek silver pens and the premium company stationery. I reached directly for a single crisp white sheet of paper. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not waste a single breath trying to justify my mental state to the concerned staff members watching through the glass. I simply stood up from my leather chair holding the piece of paper and walked deliberately around the edge of my large mahogany desk until I was standing directly in front of DeAndre. I held the crucial document out to him. It was not a binding contract. It was not a formal legal threat. It was a detailed preliminary forensic audit projection of his megachurch's heavily publicized community building fund. I had spent the last 48 hours quietly pulling public tax filings, thoroughly cross-referencing limited liability corporations, and meticulously tracing anonymous property deeds. DeAndre aggressively snatched the paper from my outstretched hand. His arrogant sneer vanished the exact second his eyes scanned the highlighted columns. The bold black numbers systematically detailed the precise trajectory of the $250,000 that had mysteriously vanished from his community youth outreach program. The comprehensive paper mapped the exact, undeniable route the stolen funds took before ending up in an offshore crypto wallet entirely controlled by Jamal. I leaned in incredibly close, ensuring my voice was barely louder than a subtle whisper, distinctly audible only to the three of them. "You want to talk about honoring your family, DeAndre?" I murmured, my voice as cold as glacial ice. "Let us talk about where Jamal actually got his initial seed money. Let us talk about the massive wire fraud you actively committed to expertly hide the missing church funds. I know absolutely everything." All the blood instantly drained from DeAndre's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. The booming pastoral authority completely evaporated. Jamal peered over DeAndre's shoulder to look at the paper, and his jaw practically hit the floor. He began to physically tremble. Vivian, sensing the sudden catastrophic shift in power, stopped her fake crying immediately. Her lace handkerchief fell to her side as she stared at the two men, realizing that whatever I had handed them was a massive death sentence. DeAndre crumpled the paper in his fist, his chest heaving with silent panic. He grabbed Vivian by the arm with a bruising grip and shoved Jamal forcefully toward the heavy oak doors. "We are leaving right now," DeAndre commanded, his voice shaking with pure terror. They stumbled backward, tripping over their own feet in their desperate rush to escape. DeAndre dragged them out into the hallway, but Vivian ripped her arm free. She turned back to face me. "You are going to lose everything for this," she hissed violently, before disappearing into the private elevator. The polished doors clicked shut. I stood alone in the center of my immaculate office, the faint scent of Vivian's expensive perfume lingering like a toxic cloud. For 14 days, an eerie, unnatural quiet settled over my life. They did not attempt another physical ambush. Instead, Vivian deployed the most lethal weapon in her arsenal, her sprawling, deeply entrenched social network. She served as the regional vice president of the city's most elite Black Women's Philanthropic League, a position that granted her unparalleled access to the wives of mayors, judges, and corporate titans. She weaponized that influence with breathtaking speed, It began with subtle whispers at charity luncheons and escalated into full-blown character assassination. 2 weeks after the lobby incident, my phone rang. It was Aunt Beatrice Vivian's oldest friend and the city's most notorious gossip. She did not call to check on my well-being. She called to fish for details. Zuri. Darling, we are all just so incredibly worried about you, she crooned, her voice thick with fake sympathy. Your mother was in tears at the country club yesterday. She told us everything about your terrible mental breakdown. I kept my voice perfectly level, shuffling a stack of quarterly reports on my desk. What exactly did she say, Beatrice? Oh, sweetheart, you do not have to hide it from us, she replied, practically vibrating with excitement. Vivian explained how the intense pressure of your firm finally caused a complete psychotic break. She said you became highly paranoid, lashing out at your own family, and worse, that you embezzled a substantial amount of money from Jamal's new venture to cover your own failing business debts. We are praying for your swift recovery. The sheer audacity of the lie was almost impressive. Vivian had preemptively flipped the narrative. By branding me as a mentally unstable embezzler, she completely discredited any future whistleblowing I might attempt regarding DeAndre's church funds. If I exposed Jamal's scam, Vivian's powerful social circle would simply view it as the paranoid ramblings of a sick, jealous daughter. Over the next 48 hours, my phone buzzed incessantly. 7 different aunts, godmothers, and prominent family friends called to offer their deeply condescending prayers. They all repeated the exact same carefully crafted script. Vivian was a heartbroken mother desperately trying to protect her troubled daughter from public ruin. They framed my financial boundaries as symptoms of a severe manic episode. I politely thanked each woman for her concern, disconnected the calls, and permanently blocked their numbers. I refused to defend myself against fabricated delusions. Engaging with their toxic gossip would only validate their twisted game. I knew my mother's ultimate goal was to isolate me completely, to starve me of community support until I crawled back on my knees begging for forgiveness. She fundamentally misunderstood my nature. I did not crave the validation of hypocritical socialites. I thrived in the cold, hard reality of absolute independence. Vivian's warfare was merely the opening salvo of a larger strike. While Vivian orchestrated my social assassination, DeAndre leveraged his extensive political connections to attack my professional livelihood. As a prominent pastor, he rubbed elbows with affluent business owners. He knew exactly who was in my client portfolio because I had secured several lucrative contracts through his charity galas. On Tuesday morning, my direct line rang. It was Marcus Vance, CEO of a mid-level logistics company that accounted for 15% of my annual revenue. Marcus was usually jovial, but today his tone was remarkably clipped. Zuri, I am calling to inform you that we will transition our accounts to a different firm, effective immediately, he stated coldly. I sat perfectly still, my eyes narrowing at the sudden hostility. Marcus, this is highly unusual. We just delivered a record-breaking quarterly return. Is there a specific issue with our performance that we need to address? There was a heavy, uncomfortable pause on the line. Listen, Zuri, off the record, DeAndre called me yesterday. He heavily implied your firm is currently under internal review for gross financial mismanagement. He advised me to protect my assets before your legal troubles become public. I cannot afford an embezzlement scandal. My brother-in-law is deliberately lying, I replied, my voice steady despite the searing anger. He is destroying my business because I refuse to cover up his fraudulent activities. I suggest you wait for proof before making a mistake based on gossip. I am sorry, Zuri, but my decision is final. He disconnected abruptly. DeAndre had successfully drawn first blood. As if a corporate hit was not sufficient, Kiara weaponized her massive social media following to publicly humiliate me. That afternoon, Chloe forwarded me a link to Kiara's latest viral video. I clicked play. Kiara sat in her pristine closet, looking into the camera with perfectly manufactured tear-filled eyes. She spoke softly, playing the ultimate victim. Sometimes God forces you to cut off toxic, jealous siblings to protect your absolute peace, Kiara whispered tragically. It breaks my heart when family members choose greed over loyalty, but you cannot heal someone who is committed to destroying you. I am leaning heavily on my faith during this incredibly dark season. The video had 80,000 likes and thousands of supportive comments. Her followers were viciously attacking the unnamed toxic sister, completely oblivious that Kiara was actively living in a mansion I saved from foreclosure. The combined assault was designed to break my spirit. They wanted me destitute, shamed, and begging for mercy. They assumed I would play defense, frantically trying to salvage my reputation while scrambling to replace lost clients. They thought I would cower in the shadows. They were catastrophically wrong. This vicious smear campaign was the ultimate declaration of war. By coming after my professional integrity, they crossed an unforgivable boundary. I quickly wiped every ounce of hesitation from my mind. I was entirely done showing them any leniency whatsoever. I was incredibly ready to completely destroy their perfect, fragile, fraudulent lives. Instead of playing defense and scrambling to protect my damaged reputation, I decided to aggressively go on the offensive. I immediately summoned David Sterling, the most ruthless and meticulous forensic accountant on my entire payroll. For years, I had quietly protected my family's deeply buried secrets. I had continuously looked the other way when the numbers on DeAndre's church ledgers seemed artificially inflated. I had silently paid Vivian's exorbitant property taxes without ever asking a single question. I had carefully shielded them from the brutal consequences of their own financial incompetence. But they had officially declared war, and I was going to absolutely obliterate their entire foundation. I instructed David and his specialized team to completely stop protecting them. I gave him full unrestricted authorization to dig into absolutely everything. Over the next 72 hours, my conference room was transformed into a high-tech war room. We pulled every single available public record. We downloaded DeAndre's megachurch tax filings, systematically cross-referencing the supposedly charitable expenditures against his personal luxury acquisitions. We relentlessly tracked the digital footprints of Jamal's various offshore cryptocurrency wallets, completely uncovering the exact methods he used to siphon money from the vulnerable congregation. We pulled property deeds, obscure loan applications, and hidden bank statements. We discovered that they were moving assets between shell accounts faster than anyone could logically monitor. Every single dollar they spent on their lavish lifestyle was completely built on a very fragile foundation of blatant deceit, systemic fraud, and stolen congregation offerings. They were all entirely complicit in this massive, overarching criminal conspiracy. I watched the mounting evidence stack up on my sleek conference table, feeling an incredibly potent mixture of absolute disgust and terrifying power. I held the exact keys to their total destruction. Late on a Friday afternoon, David walked purposefully into my office. His expression was incredibly serious, lacking his usual professional detachment. He approached my desk and deliberately dropped a massive, heavily sealed red folder right onto the polished mahogany surface. The thick folder landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed loudly throughout the quiet room. I stared at the thick red folder, my heart pounding with a cold, calculated rhythm. This was the definitive culmination of my entire investigation. I slowly reached out and unfastened the heavy string tie that secured the documents. The absolute truth was about to be laid entirely bare. I took a very slow, deep breath. I looked back up at him, my eyebrows slightly raised in silent question. "We found the missing piece of the puzzle," David stated, firmly tapping his index finger against the bold red cover. I systematically traced the entire financial history of the family estate. I followed the complex paper trail through 3 different blind limited liability companies, just like you originally requested. He leaned forward, resting his hands flat on my desk, lowering his voice into a deeply serious tone. "You are definitely going to want to see who actually owns your parents' house." I slowly flipped open the heavy red cover. The crisp white pages inside contained the absolute undeniable truth of my family's financial facade. The very first document was a master deed transfer from exactly 5 years ago. I stared at the bold black ink, completely absorbing the reality of what I had done to protect the people who currently despised me. 5 years ago, Vivian and my father had secretly faced complete and utter ruin. They had over-leveraged every single asset to maintain their lavish country club lifestyle, resulting in a terrifying notice of foreclosure on their sprawling $1.5 million estate. To save them from public humiliation, I had quietly intervened. I created a highly secure, completely blind limited liability company called Zenith Holdings. Through Zenith, I purchased the estate directly from the bank entirely in cash, effectively becoming my parents' silent landlord. I never breathed a single word of this arrangement to anyone, not even to Jamal or Kiara. I allowed my parents to save face, drafting a heavily subsidized rental agreement disguised as a modified mortgage payment. They sent a fraction of the actual market value to Zenith Holdings every month, and in exchange, they continued to parade around the city, pretending they were still the undisputed masters of their domain. Vivian hosted her elite philanthropic league meetings in a living room she technically rented from me. DeAndre filmed his prosperous lifestyle sermons in a backyard that belonged entirely to my corporate portfolio. I had given them the ultimate gift of untarnished dignity. Looking at the ironclad paperwork now, my prior generosity tasted like bitter ash. They had taken my profound sacrifice and weaponized their fake status against me, using the very stability I provided to fund their arrogant delusions. David stood silently observing my face as I traced my finger over the official property lines. He knew the massive implications of this revelation. The people who were currently attempting to destroy my professional reputation were entirely dependent on my continued mercy to keep a roof over their heads. I could legally evict the regional vice president of the Elite Black Women's League with a simple 30-day notice. I turned the page expecting to find the standard monthly payment ledgers, but the next document was entirely different. It was a massive loan application initiated just last week, flagged by the municipal clerk's office for a severe discrepancy. David tapped the center of the page. "That is where the story gets completely unhinged," he stated grimly. "Your brother-in-law and your sister apparently believed your mother still held the original deed." I frowned, scanning the complex financial terminology. The numbers did not make any sense. Why would DeAndre submit a property application for an estate he does not even live in? I flipped to the third page and the entire sickening scheme materialized right before my eyes. I stared down at the signatures located firmly on the bottom margin. They were forged, completely fake. DeAndre and Kiara had explicitly attempted to extract a massive second mortgage directly against my parents' estate. The application demanded exactly $250,000, the precise amount Jamal had miraculously lost to his catastrophic cryptocurrency scam. They were desperately trying to quietly cover his tracks before DeAndre's highly publicized church expansion completely imploded. But to execute this ridiculous financial maneuver, they required the legal homeowner's authorization. Since they arrogantly assumed my mother still legally owned the expensive property, they had simply falsified her consent. I examined the designated borrower line. Vivian's signature was flawlessly replicated in bright blue ink alongside a perfectly fabricated notary stamp. They had committed severe identity theft and blatant bank fraud in a single desperate stroke. However, the municipal clerk's automated system had instantly rejected the fraudulent application because Vivian was no longer the registered owner on file. The legal property deed belonged exclusively to Zenith Holdings, making their forged documents completely useless and highly incriminating. David crossed his arms, watching my expression harden as I processed the incredible gravity of their crimes. They essentially tried to steal $250,000 from a corporation they did not realize you secretly controlled, he explained methodically. They submitted forged legal documents to a federally insured banking institution across state lines. This is not just a family squabble anymore, Zuri. This is a massive federal offense carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, as the sheer magnitude of their stupidity washed over me. DeAndre, the charismatic pastor who literally preached about holy integrity every single Sunday, was actively attempting to defraud a bank to replace stolen church donations. Kiara, my beautiful sister, who constantly posted condescending videos about cutting off toxic family members, was actively forging our mother's legal signature. And they had the unmitigated gall to march directly into my corporate office, publicly demanding my immediate submission, while they were simultaneously attempting to illegally mortgage a house I secretly owned. The breathtaking irony was absolutely delicious. They had unknowingly handed me the ultimate weapon to guarantee their permanent destruction. If I handed this specific folder directly to the federal authorities, DeAndre's booming pastoral career would instantly vanish. Kiara would be permanently disgraced in her elite social circles. Jamal would face massive embezzlement charges from the church board. They were standing on a fragile trap door, and I held the only lever. I closed the red folder and placed my hands flat on top of it. "Secure all the original documents in the main vault," I instructed David, my voice remarkably steady. "I want certified digital copies sent directly to my encrypted private server immediately. Do not breathe a single word of this discovery to anyone else in the firm. We are going to let them continue digging their own massive grave." David nodded sharply, grabbing the red folder before turning toward the door. Just as he exited my office, Chloe buzzed my desk. "It was time, Miss Zuri," Chloe announced softly over the intercom, careful not to disturb the intense quiet that had settled over my workspace. "A specialized courier just dropped off a priority package directly from your family's church headquarters." They demanded an immediate signature confirming receipt. I pressed the silver button instructing her to bring it in. Chloe nervously entered my office holding a thick, unnecessarily oversized jet black envelope sealed with a gaudy gold wax stamp. I thanked her and sliced the heavy paper open with a sleek titanium letter opener. Inside rested an incredibly ornate, incredibly pretentious invitation printed on premium cardstock. It was the official announcement for DeAndre's highly anticipated annual event, the Community Builders Gala. This was the crown jewel of his pastoral social calendar, a massive black tie affair overflowing with local politicians, wealthy business elite, and the city's reigning mayor. DeAndre used this specific event to parade his fraudulent success and secure enormous financial pledges from unsuspecting donors. Slipping out from behind the heavy invitation was a smaller, personalized piece of stationery. I recognized Kiara's elegant, swooping handwriting immediately. She had clearly gone out of her way to include a special message just for me. "Come see what real success actually looks like." Her note read, dripping with her signature brand of passive-aggressive condescension. "We graciously reserved a spot for you, table 40 right in the very back near the kitchen doors." I stared at the handwritten insult, slowly reading it twice to fully absorb her staggering arrogance. She genuinely thought she was punishing me. She honestly believed that positioning me at the worst table in the room would somehow break my spirit and reinforce my role as the disgraced inferior sister. My family was stubbornly clinging to their shattered illusions, desperately attempting to humiliate me publicly to protect their crumbling empire. They were completely unaware that they had just handed me the absolute perfect venue for their inevitable reckoning. A slow, razor-sharp smile stretched across my face. I did not feel angry. I felt an exhilarating, deeply satisfying surge of adrenaline. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to display their fake prosperity in front of the city's most powerful figures. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but the final ending would be entirely different than they ever expected. I reached across my desk and picked up my phone, immediately dialing the direct emergency line for my elite corporate crisis public relations team. They were the absolute best in Atlanta, specializing in high-profile reputation management and strategic narrative control. The lead director answered on the very first ring, recognizing my private number instantly. "Gather the entire senior team and meet me in the main boardroom in exactly 20 minutes. I instructed, my voice humming with electric anticipation. We have a massive, highly sensitive operation to orchestrate perfectly tonight. I need you to immediately cancel all of your existing evening appointments without delay. We are going to a party. The sharp click of the conference room door sealing shut behind my top PR directors signaled the beginning of my ultimate retaliation. For years, my family had meticulously curated a narrative where I was the rugged, masculine, unpolished contrast to Kiara's glittering pageant queen persona. I deliberately played along, burying myself in tailored charcoal pantsuits and severely structured blazers to blend seamlessly into the conservative financial sector. I utilized my muted wardrobe as camouflage, allowing them to shine while I quietly managed their hidden debts. Tonight, however, the camouflage was permanently discarded. I left my corporate sanctuary and took my private elevator directly to my luxury penthouse apartment, where an exclusive stylist and a master tailor were already waiting. I had given them a single uncompromising directive. I needed a garment that commanded absolute authority and demanded undivided attention. They delivered a breathtaking custom-designed crimson gown crafted from heavy silk crepe. The dress was a masterpiece of architectural precision, featuring a plunging asymmetrical neckline and a sweeping, dramatic train that pooled like liquid fire around my metallic stilettos. The vibrant, unapologetic shade of red was a deliberate visual strike against the sea of predictable black tuxedos and pastel chiffon dresses that typically populated DeAndre's conservative charity events. I sat perfectly still before my brightly lit vanity mirror as a highly sought-after makeup artist flawlessly enhanced my natural features. She applied a bold, striking crimson lip color that exactly matched the aggressive hue of my silk gown, completely transforming my everyday appearance into something undeniably lethal. My natural curls, usually pinned back into a severe corporate bun, were expertly styled into voluminous, cascading waves that framed my face with unapologetic grandeur. I stood up and evaluated my reflection. The woman staring back was not the compliant, invisible financial savior my family had abused for decades. She was an absolute force of nature preparing to execute a flawless corporate decimation. As the stylist adjusted the hem of my dress, my lead security director entered the room holding a sleek, silver briefcase. He opened it to reveal a state-of-the-art, miniaturized communication rig. He carefully secured a microscopic earpiece deep inside my ear canal, entirely hidden beneath my thick curls. Next, he handed me a specialized military-grade encrypted smartwatch disguised as a diamond-encrusted designer accessory. This device would allow me to instantly communicate with my crisis management team stationed directly outside the gala venue and execute the digital phase of my trap with a single, discreet tap. I fastened the heavy diamond watch around my wrist, feeling the cold, firm, reassuring weight of the metal against my skin. I smoothed my hands down the sides of my fiery crimson gown, taking one final deep breath. I was absolutely finished hiding in the shadows of my family's fraudulent empire. Tonight, I was going to be the brightest, most inescapable light in the entire room, and I was going to burn their entire facade completely to the ground. While I was finalizing my physical armor, my operational strike force was actively infiltrating the gala venue. DeAndre always hosted his annual Community Builders Gala at the Grand Magnolia Atrium, a sprawling, opulent ballroom known for its massive wraparound projection screens and concert-quality sound system. DeAndre demanded absolute perfection for his vanity projects, constantly screaming at the event staff and severely underpaying his contractors to maximize his own personal profit margins. His notorious stinginess created the perfect gaping vulnerability in his security perimeter. 2 hours before the grand event officially commenced, my lead public relations operative slipped through the venue's rear loading dock entirely undetected by DeAndre's disorganized welcoming committee. My operative quietly approached the main audiovisual control booth, situated high above the sparkling ballroom floor. Inside the cramped, unventilated booth sat 3 exhausted, severely overworked technicians They were currently scrambling to troubleshoot a faulty microphone cable, openly grumbling about the miserable hourly rate DeAndre was allegedly paying them. My operative smoothly introduced himself as an independent media consultant and handed the lead technician a plain manila envelope. Inside the envelope was $10,000 in untraceable crisp $100 bills, generously labeled as a retroactive consulting fee. The terrified, overworked technician stared at the massive stack of cash, his eyes darting frantically between the envelope and my smiling operative. The instructions accompanying the heavy envelope were brilliantly simple and incredibly precise. They did not need to sabotage the entire event or damage any equipment. They simply needed to discreetly establish a secure, invisible backdoor connection between the ballroom's primary projection system and my heavily encrypted personal tablet. For $10,000 in cash, the underpaid technician eagerly agreed to bypass DeAndre's carefully approved multimedia presentation. Within exactly 12 minutes, the tech crew expertly routed a hidden wireless feed directly into the central audio-visual matrix. They established a flawlessly concealed override switch that completely bypassed the main control board. My team successfully tested the hidden connection 3 separate times, ensuring the signal strength was perfectly stable and entirely untraceable. If anyone investigated the sudden digital takeover later, the external signal routing would look like a totally random, unpredictable technical glitch caused by a faulty wireless router. My operative sent a highly encrypted confirmation text directly to my Diamond smartwatch, verifying that our digital ambush was completely locked and fully operational. DeAndre had spent the last 2 months hyping this exact gala, promising his wealthy donors a slick, professionally produced video montage highlighting his fake community outreach achievements. He had planned to stand proudly on the grand center stage, basking in the glowing light of his own manufactured glory, while asking the local city mayor for a massive public endorsement. He had absolutely no idea that I currently possessed the exclusive master key to every single massive screen in the entire building. The technological trap was perfectly set, resting silently in the digital shadows, eagerly waiting for my exact command to strike. My sleek, customized black Maybach glided silently down the dark, rain-slicked downtown streets, carrying me directly toward the glittering epicenter of DeAndre's fraudulent social empire. I sat alone in the cavernous, soundproof back seat, insulated entirely from the chaotic city noise outside the tinted privacy glass. The luxurious leather interior felt like the serene eye of a massive, impending hurricane. I rested my heavily encrypted tablet on my lap, bathing my face in the cool blue light of the glowing screen. I slowly swiped through the meticulously curated digital dossier one final time, completely verifying every single destructive element of my impending digital presentation. The irrefutable evidence was organized into a devastatingly precise chronological timeline. The first slide displayed the undeniable wire transfer logs, explicitly detailing how Jamal funneled church youth funds directly into his offshore cryptocurrency scam. The second slide highlighted the incredibly sloppy forged mortgage documents bearing my mother's fake signature, proving DeAndre and Kiara actively attempted to defraud a federal bank. The final slide contained the most satisfying documentation of all, a massive collection of formal, legally binding eviction notices and asset seizure warrants. I had officially initiated the absolute foreclosure of my parents' fake estate and completely authorized the immediate repossession of DeAndre's heavily leased luxury vehicles. Every single lie they had ever told to protect their fragile elite status was neatly packaged into a high-definition slide deck, totally ready to be broadcast to hundreds of the most influential citizens in Atlanta. I took a slow, centering breath, letting the incredible gravity of my actions settle deeply into my bones. I was about to completely eradicate my own family's public existence. I felt absolutely no guilt, no remorse, and no hesitation. They had gleefully left me to cover a massive dinner bill. They had aggressively gaslit me in my own corporate lobby. They had deliberately poisoned my professional reputation and viciously attacked my mental stability to protect a blatant criminal conspiracy. Tonight, I was simply balancing the ledger. The sleek Maybach slowly merged into the chaotic, glittering line of luxury vehicles waiting to deposit the city's most wealthy elite at the grand entrance. I could see the flashing lights of local press photographers illuminating the massive red carpet. The mayor's security detail was already swarming the front doors. My driver expertly maneuvered the massive vehicle into the premium drop-off zone, bringing the car to a perfectly smooth stop. The vehicle's interior lights softly illuminated the rich crimson fabric of my spectacular gown. I closed out the digital dossier, locked the encrypted tablet, and secured it tightly within my metallic clutch. My diamond smartwatch vibrated twice, signaling my PR team was in position. My driver quickly stepped out, rounding the hood to reach my side. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and stared through the tinted window. The heavy car door suddenly opened wide, letting the cool night air rush inside. A massive, blinding wave of bright flashbulbs exploded across my face. I smiled fiercely and stepped onto the red carpet. The blinding camera flashes washed over me as my stilettos struck the plush red carpet. Photographers clamored against the velvet ropes, their lenses desperately tracking the unexpected burst of vibrant crimson, slicing through the monotonous sea of black tuxedos and subdued evening gowns. I did not pause to pose or offer the customary manufactured smile. I glided past the press line with absolute chilling purpose. My heavy silk train swept elegantly across the floor, commanding space and demanding immediate attention from every single person hovering near the venue entrance. The massive gilded doors of the Grand Magnolia atrium swung open, revealing an opulent, breathtakingly expensive ballroom dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering floral centerpieces. DeAndre had spared absolutely no expense for his vanity project, utilizing stolen funds to rent the most exclusive venue in the entire state. A low, collective murmur rippled through the grand foyer the moment I crossed the threshold. Heads turned rapidly. Whispers ignited among the wealthy donors and influential socialites who recognized me from Vivian's vicious smear campaign. They expected to see a broken, humiliated, mentally unstable woman clinging to the shadows. Instead, they were confronted by a fiercely radiant, untouchable adversary wearing a masterpiece of bespoke tailoring. I stood perfectly tall, my expression completely unbothered by their piercing stares. I let them look. I wanted them to burn the image of my unyielding confidence directly into their memories. Less than 30 seconds after my dramatic arrival, a sharp gasp echoed from the VIP reception area. Kiara shoved her way through a cluster of affluent church elders, her face contorted with absolute fury. She wore a heavily beaded, outrageously expensive silver couture gown that I immediately recognized from a high-end boutique invoice David had intercepted just yesterday. She had charged the $30,000 garment directly to a maxed-out credit card tied to DeAndre's fraudulent secondary charity account. The sheer audacity of her stolen glamour was staggering. She marched aggressively toward me, her silver heels snapping loudly against the marble floor, completely abandoning her carefully cultivated pageant queen poise. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, terrified that my bold presence would somehow eclipse her manufactured spotlight. "What in the world are you doing here looking like that?" Kiara hissed, closing the distance between us until she was mere inches from my face. Her voice was a venomous, strained whisper, designed to evade the ears of the surrounding guests. "You were specifically instructed to enter through the side door and go straight to your assigned table. You are deliberately trying to upstage my husband's event." I looked down at her, maintaining perfect, icy composure. I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from my bodice, offering her a smile so sharp it could cut glass. "I am simply following your handwritten advice, sister," I replied smoothly. "You invited me to see what real success actually looks like. I decided to dress for the occasion." Kiara's jaw tightened, her perfectly contoured face flushing with furious, impotent rage. She opened her mouth to launch another vicious insult, but a harsh, commanding grip suddenly seized her arm. Vivian materialized from the glittering crowd, her manicured fingers digging viciously into Kiara's arm to prevent a public screaming match. My mother looked exceptionally regal in a dark sapphire gown. She quickly maneuvered both Kiara and myself away from the heavily populated entryway, forcing us into a secluded, dimly lit alcove situated directly behind a massive, towering ice sculpture of a soaring bald eagle. The melting ice cast distorted shadows across her face as she dropped her charming facade entirely. Her eyes raked over my custom crimson gown with a mixture of profound disgust and intense calculating suspicion. "How on earth did you afford that garment?" Zuri Vivian demanded, her tone dripping with absolute aristocratic disdain. "Your failing little boutique firm certainly cannot cover the cost of a bespoke silk gown. Did you steal more money from your brother's business venture to fund this ridiculous tantrum?" I stared back, unfazed by her attempt at gaslighting. My silence only infuriated her further. She stepped closer, invading my personal space with her heavy, expensive perfume. "Listen to me very carefully," Vivian snarled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "The mayor is arriving in 10 minutes. DeAndre is relying on his political endorsement tonight. You will not approach the mayor, you will not speak to any city officials, and you will absolutely not humiliate this family with your paranoid psychotic delusions. If you utter a single word to anyone important, I will personally ensure you never work in this city again." Before I could respond to her empty threats, a loud, obnoxious chuckle echoed from the other side of the ice sculpture. Jamal strolled into the secluded alcove, holding a heavy crystal tumbler filled generously with top-shelf scotch. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket and a wildly arrogant smirk, intoxicated by his own manufactured importance. "Leave the poor girl alone." "Mom?" Jamal laughed, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his expensive liquor. "She is just acting out because her sad little corporate life is falling apart. Let her wear her fancy red dress. It will not change the fact that DeAndre is about to secure a multi-million-dollar city grant tonight. Once the mayor publicly hands over that check, our foundation will be entirely untouchable. Your desperate little accounting tricks will not mean absolutely anything." He leaned against the icy pedestal, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with supreme, misplaced confidence. "We won, Zuri. We beat you at your own miserable game. Now be a good, quiet little sister. Go sit in the dark near the kitchen and watch how the real players operate." I looked at the three of them standing together in their stolen clothes, drinking stolen liquor, bragging about stealing public grant money. They were a perfect, miserable trinity of absolute corruption. I did not argue. I did not mention the federal bank fraud investigation or the hidden limited liability company that currently owned the very roof over their heads. I simply smiled, offering them a silent, chilling nod of polite acknowledgement. "Enjoy your victory tonight," I said softly, turning my back on their toxic huddle. I gracefully navigated through the labyrinth of decorated banquet tables, completely ignoring the curious stares following my vibrant crimson silhouette. As promised, Kiara had spitefully exiled me to table 40. It was located at the absolute back of the cavernous ballroom, practically pressed against the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. My designated chair offered a partially obstructed view of the main stage, blocked by a massive, towering floral arrangement. I gracefully took my seat, carefully adjusting the heavy folds of my silk train, and politely requested a glass of sparkling water with lime from a passing waiter. I settled into the plush chair, taking a slow, refreshing sip as I surveyed the sprawling, opulent room. From my isolated vantage point in the shadows, I possessed the perfect tactical overview of their entire fraudulent kingdom. The Grand Magnolia Atrium was packed with the city's most affluent, influential power brokers. I watched intently as my family aggressively worked the massive room, flawlessly executing their deceptive social choreography. Vivian floated gracefully among the wealthy church elders, her sapphire gown shimmering under the crystal chandeliers as she expertly solicited massive financial donations for their fake charitable causes. Jamal was loudly holding court near the premium open bar, shamelessly schmoozing with several prominent municipal politicians, continuously filling their glasses with expensive liquor purchased with stolen congregation offerings. Kiara was strategically positioned near the VIP velvet ropes, desperately fawning over the mayor's glamorous wife, completely unaware that the designer couture she was currently wearing would soon be seized as primary evidence in a federal bank fraud investigation. They were all grinning wildly, shaking hands, and eagerly posing for the relentless barrage of press cameras. They were completely blissfully ignorant of the digital bomb ticking silently beneath their impeccably polished designer shoes. My diamond smartwatch vibrated softly against my wrist, sending a sharp, exhilarating pulse of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. I subtly glanced down at the glowing digital display. It was a highly encrypted confirmation message directly from my crisis management team stationed in the control booth. The wireless bypass was fully secured, and the master projection feed was entirely under my command. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my sparkling water, placing the crystal glass gently onto the pristine white tablecloth. A sudden sharp screech of audio feedback briefly interrupted the soft string quartet playing in the background. The low murmur of wealthy conversation immediately faded into expectant silence as every head in the massive ballroom swiveled toward the front. DeAndre stepped confidently into the bright spotlight illuminating the center of the grand main stage. He wore a flawlessly tailored midnight blue velvet tuxedo, his charismatic smile practically blinding the eager audience. He smoothly adjusted the microphone stand, tapping the metal grid twice to ensure the sound system was fully operational. "Welcome, beloved friends and esteemed community leaders," DeAndre boomed, his rich, pastoral voice echoing loudly throughout the silent room. The heavy chandeliers dimmed, plunging the ballroom into darkness. A single brilliant white spotlight snapped on, illuminating DeAndre in the center of the grand stage. He stood tall, projecting an aura of absolute moral authority. He paused, letting the silence stretch, commanding the room with the practiced ease of a seasoned performer. When he finally spoke, his voice resonated with a deep theatrical warmth that instantly captivated the 500 wealthy donors seated before him. "We are gathered here tonight, not just as a community, but as a family," DeAndre began, opening his arms wide to embrace the audience. "In a world constantly fractured by greed and selfishness, we must fiercely protect the sacred bonds of trust, financial integrity, and unwavering loyalty." He paced slowly across the polished stage, making deliberate eye contact with the mayor and key politicians seated in the prestigious front row. DeAndre wove a masterful, intoxicating narrative about the power of selfless giving and the absolute necessity of transparent community leadership. Every word he uttered was a calculated, manipulative lie, brilliantly disguised as a divine revelation. I watched from the shadows of Table 40 as the city's most influential elite eagerly swallowed every single drop of his toxic poison. He spoke passionately about his latest youth center initiative, completely ignoring the fact that Jamal had already siphoned those exact funds into an offshore cryptocurrency void. DeAndre boldly preached about the virtues of financial stewardship while standing in a tuxedo purchased with stolen congregation offerings. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his sermon was staggering, yet the audience remained completely spellbound. They hung on his every syllable, nodding in fervent agreement, as he painted himself as the ultimate savior of their great city. Seated directly in the center of the VIP section, Vivian was practically radiating with arrogant pride. Her sapphire gown caught the stage lights as she beamed at her son-in-law, playing the role of the devoted, prosperous matriarch to absolute perfection. Kiara sat beside her, dabbing at fake manufactured tears of joy. They were entirely convinced that their empire was permanently secured, completely insulated by DeAndre's magnetic public persona. DeAndre's voice swelled with crescendoing emotion as he detailed his ambitious multi-million-dollar vision for the church expansion. He expertly manipulated the crowd's emotions, transitioning seamlessly from inspiring anecdotes to urgent pleas for financial commitment. He looked directly at the mayor, silently demanding the political endorsement that would solidify his untouchable status. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, my metallic stiletto tapping a silent, steady rhythm against the carpeted floor. The louder DeAndre preached about honesty and family values, the tighter my grip became on the hidden digital detonator strapped to my wrist. He was building his own towering pedestal, making himself larger than life, completely unaware that a higher pedestal only guaranteed a much more devastating fatal fall. The crowd erupted into thunderous standing applause as DeAndre finished his opening monologue. He bowed his head with mock humility, soaking in their absolute adoration. DeAndre slowly raised his hands, gesturing for the thunderous applause to subside. The room settled back into a hushed, expectant silence, eagerly awaiting his next charismatic directive. He walked to the very edge of the stage, his expression shifting from triumphant joy to a mask of deep, manufactured sorrow. He bowed his head slightly, adopting the tone of a burdened, compassionate patriarch. "Tonight is about building a better future," DeAndre proclaimed softly, his voice echoing with calculated melancholy. "But we cannot truly heal our community until we heal the brokenness within our own homes. My family is not immune to the painful struggles of mental instability and profound moral confusion." He sighed heavily, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. I sat perfectly still in the dark, my spine rigid against the back of my chair. I knew exactly what was coming. DeAndre had decided to use this massive public platform to complete my social assassination. He raised his head and pointed a dramatic, accusing finger directly toward the swinging kitchen doors at the absolute rear of the cavernous ballroom. "We even have our prodigal sister Zuri here tonight," DeAndre announced, his booming voice cutting through the silent room like a serrated blade. "Please, everyone, send your deepest prayers and positive energy to Table 40. We are praying relentlessly for her troubled soul and her swift recovery from her unfortunate financial and emotional breakdown." The collective gasp from the audience was instantaneous and audible. 500 heads swiveled in unison, turning away from the brightly lit stage to peer into the dim shadows where I sat isolated. The heavy silence was replaced by a wave of frantic, hushed whispers. The city's elite power brokers, politicians, and wealthy socialites stared at my vibrant crimson gown with naked, overwhelming pity. I could see the condescension burning in their eyes. DeAndre had successfully branded me as the tragic, unstable outcast in front of the entire metropolitan hierarchy. He had weaponized their sympathy, transforming my forced exile into a public exhibition of his own boundless forgiving grace. In the VIP section, Vivian and Kiara turned to look at me, their faces twisted into identical masks of fake concern, while their eyes danced with vicious, triumphant glee. They had orchestrated this exact moment of maximum humiliation, designing the seating chart specifically to highlight my physical and social isolation. DeAndre stood on the stage, basking in the warm glow of the crowd's admiration for his stunning display of familial loyalty. He had painted himself as the forgiving saint offering sanctuary to a damaged, chaotic sinner. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away from their piercing, judgmental stares. I kept my posture absolutely flawless. My chin held high, meeting the collective gaze of the ballroom with eyes as cold and hard as uncut diamonds. I let them look at the so-called prodigal sister. I wanted them to see a woman who was entirely unbroken by their pathetic, orchestrated theater. DeAndre's cruel public ambush was intended to shatter my final ounce of dignity, forcing me to cower in shame before the city's reigning elite. Instead, it merely fueled the roaring fire burning steadily inside my chest. DeAndre was not satisfied with merely labeling me as a broken outcast. He had engineered a far more sinister, inescapable trap designed to completely drain my remaining resources while simultaneously forcing my public submission. He smiled down at the crowd, his voice adopting an aggressive, booming cheerfulness that masked his lethal intentions. "But tonight is a night of miraculous healing and incredible redemption," DeAndre shouted, throwing his arms wide open. "Our family stands united in our mission to build this community. to prove her commitment to her ongoing recovery, and to demonstrate absolute family unity, Zuri has generously agreed to make a monumental sacrifice. He paused dramatically, letting the anticipation swell throughout the opulent room. I stared at him, my mind racing as the contours of his vicious extortion tactic materialized. He was going to financially corner me in front of the mayor. Zuri has officially pledged a remarkable $100,000 to our new church building fund tonight. DeAndre roared into the microphone. The ballroom erupted into shocked, deafening cheers. The wealthy donors clapped wildly, completely oblivious to the brutal psychological warfare unfolding right in front of them. The sheer, breathtaking malice of his strategy was almost brilliant. DeAndre knew exactly how to weaponize my professional reputation against me. By publicly announcing a massive six-figure donation, he had backed me into an impossible, suffocating corner. If I accepted the pledge, I would be actively funding the very fraudulent empire I intended to destroy, while essentially begging for their forgiveness. If I publicly declined the donation in front of the mayor, 500 elite guests, and the local press, I would instantly validate their entire smear campaign. I would look like a bitter, jealous, greedy monster refusing to support a charitable community cause and rejecting my family's loving embrace. DeAndre was aggressively forcing me to choose between absolute financial submission and total social suicide. He stood on the stage grinning like a predator who had just cornered its prey. He nodded toward the back of the room, executing his final devastating maneuver. "Let us hear directly from our generous healing sister," DeAndre commanded. Suddenly, a blinding, high-intensity spotlight snapped away from the main stage, slicing through the darkness to hit me dead center. The brilliant white beam illuminated my crimson gown, making me glow like a beacon against the dark catering doors. The crowd turned toward me again, their applause dying down into a thick, expectant silence. A tuxedo-clad usher hurried over to table 40, his expression intensely serious, as he abruptly thrust a wireless microphone directly into my hand. The heavy metallic device felt cold against my palm. 500 of the most powerful people in Atlanta held their collective breath, waiting to see if the disgraced sister would obediently fall in line. Kiara and Vivian watched from the front row, their eyes glittering with absolute victorious certainty. They fully expected me to break. They assumed I would politely accept the extortion, choke out a fake apology, and surrender my dignity to save my career. The heavy silence stretched, suffocating and tense. I gripped the microphone, staring straight through the blinding spotlight. The heavy silk of my crimson gown rustled softly against the floor, a sound that seemed abnormally loud in the breathless vacuum of the ballroom. 500 pairs of eyes remained fixed on me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown, waiting for the prodigal sister to fold under the immense pressure of DeAndre's extortion. Instead of bowing my head in shame, I lifted my chin. I met the collective gaze of Atlanta's most powerful elite with a stare so unnervingly calm, so fiercely lethal, that the nearest guests actually shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I took a deep breath, allowing the silence to stretch long enough to make everyone in the room feel incredibly, undeniably anxious. I brought the cold metal microphone closer to my lips. My thumb brushed the activation switch. A sharp click echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, completely shattering the heavy tension. "I am afraid Pastor DeAndre is significantly mistaken about my donation tonight," I announced. My voice was perfectly steady, resonating with crisp, undeniable authority that bounced off the cavernous ceiling. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Defying a beloved pastor on an open microphone was absolute social heresy. In the front row, Vivian's spine snapped straight. The smug smirk on Kiara's face instantly dissolved into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. They recognized the glacial, unyielding tone of my voice. It was the exact tone I used during hostile corporate takeovers. DeAndre gripped the edges of his wooden podium, his knuckles turning white. He leaned into his own microphone, attempting to hijack the narrative before it completely derailed. "Now, Zuri," We know you are currently experiencing a severe emotional crisis, he patronized, forcing a deep chuckle that sounded remarkably thin. There is absolutely no need to be embarrassed about your financial limitations, but I did not yield the floor. I took a very slow, deliberate step away from my isolated table, moving directly into the center aisle. I am not experiencing an emotional crisis, DeAndre. I corrected smoothly, my voice cutting through his fake pastoral warmth with surgical precision. And I am certainly not embarrassed by my financial status. In fact, my financial stability is the exact reason I came here tonight. I paused, letting the heavy implication hang in the air. The ballroom was completely paralyzed. Politicians stopped whispering. Wealthy donors froze with their champagne glasses suspended. But since you brought it up, I continued, my voice echoing with devastating clarity. We are definitely going to talk about financial unity. And more importantly, we are going to talk about exactly where this community's generous donations have been going. I raised my left hand, the diamonds on my encrypted smartwatch catching the spotlight. I traced my finger across the glass interface. I tapped the glowing screen exactly once. The highly sophisticated digital command shot through the silent void, racing directly toward the audiovisual control booth high above the grand ballroom floor. The ultimate irreversible trap was now officially completely sprung. The instant my finger tapped the smartwatch screen, the massive 20-foot LED displays towering behind DeAndre aggressively glitched. The pristine, glowing church logo, a majestic gold cross surrounded by stylized doves, violently warped into a distorted mess of jagged digital static. A loud electronic buzzing noise ripped through the ballroom speakers, causing several guests in the front row to physically jump in their seats. DeAndre spun around, his velvet tuxedo jacket whipping through the air as he stared at the malfunctioning screens. "What is going on back there?" he demanded, his pastoral facade cracking instantly. "Fix the visual feed immediately." But the underpaid audiovisual technicians were no longer in control. My crisis management team had completely hijacked the central matrix. The jagged static vanished, replaced by a glaring high-definition projection of raw, irrefutable data. Massive, towering spreadsheets materialized on the screens, illuminating the entire stage in a harsh, unforgiving blue light. DeAndre's eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror. The documents towering 20 feet above his head were the highly classified, deeply buried banking ledgers from his supposedly untouchable offshore accounts. "Cut the feed," DeAndre screamed, completely abandoning his microphone. He lunged toward the edge of the stage, waving his arms frantically at the control booth suspended near the ceiling. "I said cut the feed right now." But the dark glass of the AV booth remained completely impenetrable. The technicians inside had already secured the heavy deadbolt, fulfilling their generous $10,000 consulting contract by making themselves entirely unavailable. DeAndre was completely stranded on his own stage, dwarfed by the massive glowing evidence of his own breathtaking corruption. The audience erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. Prominent business owners squinted at the giant screens, their trained eyes quickly recognizing the unmistakable formatting of international wire transfers and heavily redacted shell company transactions. Vivian leaped from her front row seat, her sapphire gown tangling around her legs as she frantically signaled to the venue security guards. Kiara was frantically tapping on her phone, desperately trying to message someone, anyone, to stop the unfolding disaster. Jamal stood completely paralyzed near the open bar, his glass of expensive scotch slipping from his numb fingers and shattering loudly against the marble floor. He recognized the specific account numbers glowing brightly on the massive screens. They were his deeply hidden cryptocurrency wallets. The room was descending into absolute pandemonium, but my voice sliced through the chaos, amplified flawlessly by the wireless microphone, still clutched firmly in my hand. "Please direct your attention to the primary display," I instructed calmly, my voice resonating with cold, commanding authority. Since Pastor DeAndre is so deeply concerned about family financial unity, I thought it was incredibly important to share exactly how unified his finances have become with your generous charitable contributions. The crowd instantly quieted their attention, snapping back and forth between my striking crimson silhouette in the center aisle and the devastating financial documents glowing brightly behind their beloved panicked pastor. I began my slow, deliberate march down the center aisle, my crimson train gliding smoothly across the plush carpet. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured cadence of an executioner approaching the block. The sea of wealthy donors parted instinctively, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly toward the main stage. I raised the microphone, keeping my eyes locked dead onto DeAndre's panicked, sweating face. What you are currently viewing on the main screen is not a record of community outreach, I narrated, my voice echoing with devastating clarity. This is a certified, legally binding bank statement from exactly 3 weeks ago. I paused, letting my crisis team advance the slide to the next crucial document. The massive screens seamlessly transitioned, magnifying a highly specific, undeniable transaction record. Notice the highlighted row, I continued, my voice echoing off the opulent chandeliers. This is a direct, unauthorized transfer of exactly $250,000. These funds were originally earmarked for the highly publicized community youth center. Instead, Pastor DeAndre intentionally wired every single penny of that charitable grant directly into an unregistered offshore cryptocurrency account. The ballroom erupted. A collective, horrified gasp ripped through the audience. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in absolute shock. I kept moving forward, my stilettos clicking rhythmically. But the blatant corruption does not end there, I announced, signaling for the final lethal slide. The screen flashed again, revealing the undeniable proof of ownership for the offshore wallet. That specific cryptocurrency account is completely controlled by my brother Jamal. He lost your generous community donations in a massive, idiotic digital scam, and Pastor DeAndre has been actively draining the church building fund to cover his catastrophic losses. The reaction was explosive. In the front row, the city's reigning mayor shot up from his seat as if he had been physically struck. His face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated political terror. He had personally endorsed the youth center grant. Being publicly tied to a $250,000 embezzlement scandal would instantly obliterate his entire political career. He immediately turned to his security detail, barking frantic orders to completely distance himself from my family. Vivian shrieked desperately, trying to grab the microphone stand near the edge of the stage, but the massive floral arrangements blocked her path. Kiara buried her face in her hands, her fake socialite facade crumbling into absolute public ruin. I finally reached the end of the aisle. I gripped the wooden handrail and smoothly ascended the short staircase, stepping directly onto the brightly lit stage. The brilliant spotlight now illuminated both of us, trapping DeAndre in the harsh, glaring truth. I walked slowly across the polished wooden floor until I was standing mere inches away from him. He was trembling violently, his charismatic swagger completely annihilated by the undeniable reality projected 20 feet above his head. I lowered the microphone, staring deeply into his severely panicked expression, looking him dead in the eyes. "Turn that off right now. She is completely lying," Vivian shrieked from the front row, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. She lunged forward, pressing her body against the velvet ropes separating the VIP section from the main stage, her sapphire gown snagging roughly on the brass clasps. Her eyes were wild, darting between the horrified donors and the towering LED screens projecting their financial ruin. "Someone call security and have this delusional woman removed from the building." I did not break eye contact with DeAndre. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he stared at the microphone in my hand like it was a loaded weapon. He was utterly paralyzed by the sudden brutal exposure of his hidden empire. I slowly turned my head toward my mother, offering her a chilling, impassive smile. I lifted my left hand, displaying the glowing screen of my encrypted smartwatch. "I assure you, Mother Mathematics do not possess the capacity to lie," I stated calmly, my voice resonating with lethal precision across the grand ballroom. But since you are so aggressively eager to discuss the concept of blatant dishonesty, let us explore another fascinating chapter of our family financial history. I clicked a specific button on my secure mobile phone. The massive 20-foot screens behind DeAndre instantly flickered. The damning offshore bank statements dissolved seamlessly, replaced by a high-definition scan of a highly sensitive legal document. The crowd leaned forward collectively, squinting at the glowing digital projection. It was a massive multi-page federal mortgage application. This specific document is particularly interesting, I narrated, pacing slowly across the polished wooden stage. And this is my sister Kiara, forging a signature to take out a loan on the house of our parents. Please direct your attention to the magnified signature line at the absolute bottom of the screen. The projection zoomed in aggressively, illuminating the shaky, unnatural cursive scrawl bearing the name of Vivian. A sharp collective gasp ripped through the audience of wealthy socialites and powerful politicians. The evidence was absolutely undeniable. Kiara and DeAndre deliberately falsified these federal loan documents to secure a secondary mortgage, I explained. My tone as clinical and detached as a prosecuting attorney presenting a final closing argument. They intentionally bypassed all legal authorization, utilizing an illegally obtained notary stamp to extract $500,000 from a property they did not legally own. That money was funneled directly into the exact same offshore accounts, currently bleeding this generous congregation completely dry. Kiara collapsed back into her plush VIP seat, her face draining of all color. She clamped both hands over her mouth, visibly trembling, as the most affluent elite turned their collective, judgmental glare directly onto her. The beautiful pageant queen persona she had meticulously cultivated for decades evaporated instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, exposed fraud. DeAndre took a shaky step backward, utterly defeated. He desperately searched the room for a single sympathetic face, but found absolutely nothing. His entire kingdom was dead. I slowly turned my attention back to the front row where Vivian stood completely frozen. The sheer terror radiating from her rigid posture was incredibly satisfying to witness. She had always valued her pristine social status above everything else, ruthlessly sacrificing my emotional well-being to protect her fragile illusion of absolute perfection. Now that precious illusion was rapidly disintegrating into toxic dust. I walked to the edge of the grand stage, looking down at my mother with profound indifference. "Speaking of that specific house, Mom," I announced, my voice carrying effortlessly through the silent, captivated ballroom. "You so eagerly kicked me out of the family chat last month, aggressively demanding that I completely sever all ties with your pristine kingdom. You viciously proclaimed that my presence was a toxic burden you could no longer endure. However, in your arrogant haste to finally exile me, you carelessly forgot one incredibly crucial financial detail." Vivian swallowed hard, her carefully painted lips trembling uncontrollably. She shook her head silently, pleading with me to stop. I completely ignored her desperate, silent begging. "I actually own that luxury mansion through my private limited liability company." I declared the words, striking her like physical blows. "I purchased the foreclosed property 3 years ago when your husband secretly bankrupted the primary estate account. I have been silently paying your massive monthly expenses from the absolute shadows, subsidizing your glamorous lifestyle while you constantly mocked my modest corporate suits." The elite crowd began muttering rapidly, pointing at Vivian with absolute disgust. She had spent years bragging about her generational wealth. "And since you have not paid the substantial rent, I finally cut off last week. Here is your official 30-day eviction notice," I stated, tapping my phone again. The massive screens shifted instantaneously. A stark, undeniable legal eviction notice flashed brightly across the 20-foot display, completely illuminating the dark stage. The bold black text legally demanded the immediate vacation of the luxurious property. Vivian let out a horrific strangled gasp, physically stumbling backward until Jamal caught her trembling arms. Her entire social identity was absolutely obliterated. She was officially homeless, publicly shamed, and completely ruined. The incredibly wealthy donors she had ruthlessly manipulated for decades were now staring at her like she was an infected, toxic plague. The mighty matriarch had finally fallen completely from grace. Her knees buckled beneath the heavy sapphire fabric as the brutal reality of her complete destitution crushed her fragile spirit. Jamal tried to pull her away toward the exit, but the furious crowd instantly blocked their only escape route, trapping them inside their own spectacular nightmare. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of my undeniable vengeance. I simply watched her cry, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard, unadulterated triumph as the eviction notice continued to glow brilliantly above us. This was the exact moment I had meticulously planned for years. The ledger was now perfectly balanced, and their fraudulent empire was finally burning directly to the ground. DeAndre suddenly snapped out of his terrified trance. His survival instincts violently kicked in, overriding his paralyzing shock. With a furious, animalistic roar, he lunged aggressively across the stage, desperately reaching for the microphone firmly clutched in my right hand. I anticipated his pathetic strike. I swiftly stepped back, my crimson silk gown swirling elegantly out of his frantic reach. He stumbled clumsily, nearly collapsing face first onto the hard, polished floor. The crowd gasped at his violent, undignified outburst. "Oh, and Kiara," I projected, pivoting smoothly to address my sister, who was now sobbing loudly near the velvet ropes. "Before you foolishly attempt to defend your deeply corrupted husband, you might seriously want to look at slide 4. I tapped the screen of my mobile phone one final time. The massive eviction notice instantly vanished, replaced by a devastating collage of explosive personal evidence. High-definition images of luxury hotel receipts completely plastered the towering 20-foot screens. Beside the exorbitant credit card charges lay a series of highly explicit, deeply romantic text messages. The timestamps perfectly matched the hotel bookings. The recipient of those messages was clearly identified in massive, bold letters. It was the lead director of the church choir. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute auditory chaos. Women shrieked in genuine horror, while angry donors began shouting vicious insults directly at the disgraced pastor. DeAndre fell to his knees, covering his face in total defeat, as his darkest secret was broadcast to the world. Kiara stood completely motionless, staring blankly at the explicit messages, proving her husband had systematically betrayed her trust for years. Her hands began trembling violently. The expensive crystal champagne glass slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the solid marble floor, shattering into hundreds of tiny, glittering shards that scattered everywhere. The sharp, distinct sound of breaking glass perfectly symbolized the absolute destruction of their meticulously curated facade. My family was officially broken, completely stripped of their unearned wealth, stolen prestige, and fake moral superiority. I had successfully executed the flawless corporate decimation I had promised myself. I lowered the microphone, allowing the chaotic screaming of the angry mob to completely consume the opulent room. Suddenly, a piercing, high-pitched wail sliced clearly through the deafening roar of the panicked crowd. Everyone froze. The aggressive flashing of red and blue emergency lights began violently reflecting against the tall stained glass windows near the grand entrance. Sirens were wailing loudly outside the venue, growing exponentially closer by the second. My PR director had delivered the federal evidence box to the authorities exactly on schedule. DeAndre looked toward the doors in pure dread as the sirens finally stopped, indicating the police had officially surrounded the entire luxury building. The federal agents were storming the gala, and there was absolutely nowhere left for my corrupt family to run. My ultimate retaliation was now completely, perfectly, and undeniably finished, sealing their dark fate forever in cold steel handcuffs. The night was officially over. The truth won. The flashing emergency lights strobed violently against the stained glass windows, throwing the Grand Magnolia atrium into a state of absolute, unmitigated pandemonium. The initial shock that had paralyzed the 500 wealthy guests rapidly dissolved, instantly replaced by a tidal wave of ferocious, unadulterated outrage. Prominent philanthropists and influential church elders shoved their way out of their plush velvet chairs, their faces contorted with pure fury. They stormed toward the front of the stage, brandishing their expensive phones and shouting aggressively over the deafening ambient noise. Furious donors demanded the immediate return of their squandered financial contributions, their voices merging into a chaotic, terrifying roar that completely drowned out the soft string quartet, which had long since fled the room. Several affluent socialites began throwing their crystal champagne flutes onto the marble floor, shattering them in a spectacular display of wealthy, unrestrained wrath. On the grand main stage, DeAndre remained frozen on his knees, his perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo now looking like a pathetic, ruined costume. He raised his hands desperately trying to pacify the encroaching, hostile mob, but his legendary charismatic voice was entirely gone. Before he could utter a single pathetic excuse, Kiara launched herself across the polished wooden floor. The illusion of her pageant queen poise was completely eradicated. She lunged at her disgraced husband like a rabid animal, her expensive silver couture gown ripping at the seams as she tackled him. Her hand connected viciously with his jaw. The sharp, resounding slap echoed through the microphone that was still lying active on the floorboards. She struck him again and again, screaming incoherently about the choir director and the deep, unforgivable humiliation he had brought upon her precious social standing. DeAndre threw his arms over his face, cowering pathetically beneath his wife's relentless physical assault. While the violent marital destruction unfolded under the bright stage lights, I kept my eyes scanning the chaotic perimeter. Through the throngs of panicked guests and shattered floral centerpieces, I spotted Jamal. He was attempting to use the intense distraction to execute a cowardly, silent escape. He slipped away from the open premium bar, creeping along the heavily shadowed wall toward the rear service exit. He clutched a stolen bottle of top-tier scotch in one hand, his velvet tuxedo jacket torn and soaked in spilled liquor. He reached the heavy metal swinging doors, pushing them open with a desperate heavy shove. However, his pathetic attempt at evasion was instantly thwarted. Two massive, broad-shouldered men in dark tactical suits stepped out of the shadows, physically blocking his only available exit. They were my personal, highly paid private security contractors. They grabbed Jamal by his shoulders, roughly shoving him backward into the brightly lit ballroom. He stumbled clumsily, dropping the expensive scotch bottle. It shattered loudly across the tile. He was entirely trapped, caged inside the very venue his family had rented to flaunt their stolen wealth. The absolute chaos unfolding perfectly around me was truly beautiful. Their ruin was total. The towering gilded doors of the grand foyer suddenly burst open with a tremendous, deafening crash that completely overpowered the screaming crowd. A highly organized tactical squad of severe, unsmiling detectives from the Federal Financial Crimes Unit flooded into the opulent ballroom. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, their dark windbreakers clearly emblazoned with bold, reflective gold lettering that commanded immediate compliance. I had anonymously forwarded the entire encrypted forensic file to their lead investigator 3 days ago, providing them with irrefutable, completely verified evidence of the family's extensive criminal conspiracy. The detectives rapidly secured the main exits, forming an impenetrable human barricade against the panicked, fleeing socialites. The lead investigator, a tall, imposing woman with a deeply stern expression, marched straight down the center aisle, her heavy boots crushing the discarded flower petals and broken crystal shards. She did not even glance at the terrified donors or the weeping politicians. Her unwavering focus was permanently locked onto the brightly lit stage. The sea of frantic guests parted instantly, desperately scrambling to avoid any accidental association with the impending highly public arrests. The investigator swiftly ascended the short wooden staircase, completely ignoring Kiara, who was currently curled into a pathetic sobbing ball near the podium. DeAndre attempted to stand up, his hands shaking violently as he forced a weak, utterly unconvincing smile of innocence. He opened his mouth to deploy his legendary charming rhetoric, but the lead investigator sharply raised her hand, instantly silencing his useless, pathetic lies. Pastor DeAndre, you are officially under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, grand larceny, and federal embezzlement. The investigator announced, her voice booming with cold, absolute authority. She ruthlessly grabbed his right arm, violently spinning him around. The sharp, distinctive metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the room. DeAndre finally broke, openly weeping as the cold metal permanently locked his fate. He was forcefully shoved toward the waiting officers. Meanwhile, across the massive ballroom, another squad of determined detectives had successfully intercepted my brother. Jamal was aggressively thrashing against my private security contractors, screaming arrogant, drunken threats about his supposed legal immunity. Two federal agents seamlessly took control of the pathetic struggle. They slammed Jamal brutally against the nearest banquet table, sending expensive silverware crashing to the floor. You are under arrest for international money laundering and running an unauthorized offshore cryptocurrency scheme. The arresting officer growled, twisting Jamal's arms behind his back. The heavy handcuffs clicked shut with terrifying finality. Jamal's arrogant, untouchable demeanor completely vanished, replaced by the pathetic, cowardly whimpering of a spoiled child, realizing his stolen wealth could no longer buy his freedom. The entire ballroom watched in absolute horrified silence as the two supposedly upstanding pillars of the local community were paraded out in absolute humiliating disgrace. The untouchable Golden Boys were now just common criminals, utterly humiliated and permanently broken. I smiled softly, deeply, savoring the sweet, undeniable, absolute justice surrounding my glorious, flawlessly executed corporate retaliation. The flashing blue and red emergency lights continued to spill through the ballroom windows, casting an eerie, chaotic glow over the ruined gala. As the federal agents firmly marched DeAndre and Jamal out through the grand entrance, the remaining guests scrambled desperately to escape the toxic fallout. I stood alone in the center of the shattered venue, my heavy crimson silk dress still pooling immaculately around my stilettos. The ultimate decimation of my family's fraudulent empire was now complete. Suddenly, a trembling, desperate hand clamped down aggressively onto my left arm. I turned slowly, my expression completely guarded, to see Vivian standing beside me. She was a pathetic, shattered mirror image of the arrogant, untouchable matriarch who had confronted me just hours ago. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a tangled mess, and mascara ran in dark, ugly rivers down her tear-stained cheeks. Her expensive sapphire gown, the symbol of her stolen elite status, now hung limply on her shaking frame. She had been brutally stripped of her dignity, her precious societal ranking utterly annihilated in front of the entire city. Vivian gripped my arm tighter, her expensive acrylic nails digging painfully into my bare skin. "How could you possibly do this to your own blood, Zuri?" she sobbed, her voice a ragged, hysterical shriek that echoed off the high, gilded ceiling. "We are your family. You have completely destroyed our entire lives. You have taken absolutely everything from us." She wept uncontrollably, desperately searching my face for even a single ounce of sympathy, regret, or familial hesitation. I stared down at the broken woman clinging to my arm. For decades, I had eagerly sought her maternal approval, enduring endless psychological abuse just to feel visible in her shadow. I had quietly covered their debts, tolerated their vicious gaslighting, and swallowed my own pride to maintain their pathetic facade. But staring at her now, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, agonizing well of daughterly devotion was completely dry. I reached down and smoothly detached her trembling fingers from my skin, removing her desperate grip with cold, practiced precision. I looked directly into her completely devastated eyes, my own expression entirely devoid of emotion. "I didn't do this, Vivian," I stated softly, my voice completely devoid of pity, anger, or remorse. "I just turned on the lights. I turned my back on my weeping mother without another word." I gracefully lifted the heavy silk train of my fiery crimson gown and began walking steadily toward the exit. The high heels of my metallic stilettos clicked a final rhythmic beat against the polished marble floor. I did not look back at the sobbing matriarch, the shattered glass, or the massive glowing screens exposing their lies. I stepped out into the cool, crisp, refreshing night air, leaving them completely alone to rot in the absolute permanent ruins of their own spectacular making. I was finally entirely and undeniably free from their endless toxic grip. My brilliant future awaited me out in the dark. The ensuing 30 days passed in a relentless, magnificent blur of absolute corporate and social destruction. My highly calculated digital ambush had triggered a catastrophic avalanche that entirely decimated my family's fraudulent empire. DeAndre was officially indicted on 47 federal charges of wire fraud and grand embezzlement within 48 hours of his arrest. The deeply humiliated church board held an emergency midnight session unanimously voting to permanently strip him of his pastoral title and immediately severing all ties to his completely ruined foundation. He was currently languishing in a federal holding cell, desperately attempting to negotiate a plea deal that nobody was willing to offer. Kiara was absolutely shattered by the deeply public revelation of her husband's extensive infidelities. She immediately filed for a highly contested divorce, scrambling blindly to salvage whatever pathetic remnants of her shattered pageant queen reputation remained. However, her aggressive legal maneuvers were completely useless. The authorities aggressively froze every single bank account associated with their fraudulent enterprises. Kiara was forced to officially file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, trading her $30,000 designer couture gowns for cheap sweatpants as she moved into a cramped, depressing budget apartment complex. Jamal was experiencing his own spectacular downfall. He was formally denied bail, deemed a severe flight risk due to his vast network of offshore cryptocurrency contacts. He sat miserably in a high-security county jail, nervously awaiting a massive federal trial that would inevitably result in a lengthy, devastating prison sentence. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy had been permanently caged, entirely stripped of his stolen luxury vehicles and premium scotch. The most incredibly satisfying downfall, however, belonged exclusively to Vivian. The stark eviction notice I had proudly displayed on the ballroom screen was flawlessly executed by my aggressive legal team. My private limited liability company successfully foreclosed on the sprawling suburban mansion she had ruthlessly paraded as her own. I ruthlessly liquidated the massive property to a wealthy commercial developer, securing an astronomical seven-figure profit that completely bypassed Vivian's frozen accounts. The mighty, condescending matriarch was forcefully reduced to weeping uncontrollably while packing her remaining cheap possessions into generic brown cardboard moving boxes. The incredibly perfect, highly envied family was now utterly, undeniably destroyed. Their entire kingdom of lies had collapsed into a pathetic pile of useless rubble. I had decisively severed the toxic bloodline, forever leaving them to rot in utter bleak despair. Far removed from the suffocating, corrupted atmosphere of Atlanta, I now resided peacefully in my brand-new, modern penthouse apartment, located high above the bustling streets of New York City. The sprawling, minimalist space was bathed entirely in glorious, warm sunlight, streaming directly through the massive, spotless floor-to-ceiling windows. I had successfully relocated my thriving boutique accounting firm, officially leaving behind the toxic wreckage of my former existence. My business was flourishing exponentially, completely unburdened by the parasitic leeches I had once been forced to protect. I was finally breathing wonderfully crisp, beautifully clean air. I walked slowly across the sleek, polished hardwood floor, admiring the breathtaking, unobstructed view of the majestic Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly before me. Suddenly, the sharp, rhythmic ringing of my personal cell phone pierced the serene, quiet atmosphere. I casually picked up the slim silver device resting quietly on my beautiful marble kitchen island. The glowing screen displayed an unknown, unlisted phone number from a Georgia area code. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of absolute apathy. I did not bother pressing the green button. I simply tossed the device back onto the smooth counter, letting the incessant ringing finally trip over into my automated voicemail system. A few minutes later, a silent notification alert popped brightly onto the locked screen. I calmly tapped the tiny play icon, placing the phone firmly on speaker mode. The pathetic, incredibly ragged sound of a broken woman crying instantly filled the pristine kitchen. It was Vivian. Her previously haughty, aristocratic voice was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic, whimpering sob. "I am begging you to help us," Vivian cried loudly, her pathetic words choking on her own manufactured tears. "You are the only family we have left in this world. Please, Zuri, we need you." I stood completely silently in the beautiful sunlit kitchen, listening intently to the pathetic, broken audio recording until the desperate sobbing eventually dissolved into a pathetic, defeated whimper. A faint, wonderfully peaceful smile slowly touched the absolute corners of my mouth. I felt absolutely no lingering anger, no residual bitterness, and certainly no obligation to offer any undeserved salvation. Without even a single ounce of hesitation, I firmly pressed the red delete icon, instantly erasing her desperate weeping pleas from my digital inbox forever. I swiftly navigated through my personal phone settings, selecting her specific contact profile, and permanently blocked the number. The heavy, burdensome chains of my miserable past were now officially permanently severed, leaving me completely unbothered. I walked gracefully away from the completely silent, incredibly sleek kitchen island, my bare feet padding softly across the warm, expansive hardwood floor. I slowly approached the massive, stunning floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out over the stunning, majestic expanse of the iconic Manhattan skyline far below me. The towering, glittering skyscrapers stretched endlessly toward the remarkably bright blue horizon, symbolizing absolute, boundless, and brilliant opportunity for my future. I finally reached over to my chilled crystal bar cart and smoothly poured myself a tall, highly elegant glass of extremely expensive premium vintage champagne. The beautiful golden liquid bubbled cheerfully, flawlessly, catching the bright sunlight in a dazzling, spectacular, and truly sparkling display. I raised the beautiful crystal flute to the city, taking a very slow, deeply satisfying sip. The crisp, unbelievably delicious champagne tasted exactly like absolute pure and completely unadulterated freedom. Sometimes the most brutal revenge isn't an act of anger. It's simply stepping out of the way and letting toxic people drown in the consequences of their own actions. True power doesn't scream, it watches. Fade to black.